Hi, I'm Cameron. While I was building a career across the country, my parents handed my sister Victoria our entire family inheritance. The vineyard, the savings, everything. But when they tried to force me to sign away my rights to the family home, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. My name was already on the deed, and I had been for 15 years. Want to know what happened when they realized their perfect plan had one massive flaw? Before we dive in, let us know. Have you ever discovered family secrets that changed everything you thought you knew? Drop a comment below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone call came on a Thursday evening. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my Denver office when my mother's contact lit up my screen. We hadn't spoken in 4 months, not since the awkward Christmas dinner where Victoria had announced her new responsibilities with the family business. Something in my gut told me not to answer, but 28 years of conditioning made me swipe green. "Cameron, darling, how are you?" My mother's voice carried that particular strain I'd learned to recognize. The tone that meant something was very wrong, but she was trying to pretend otherwise. "I'm fine, Mom. Working late as usual. What's going on?" "Well, your father and I have been thinking, and with Victoria taking over the vineyard operations, we believe it's time to simplify our affairs. We're getting older, and we want to make sure everything is properly organized." I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the Denver skyline twinkle in the darkness. Simplify how? There was a pause, the kind of pause that feels like a knife hanging in the air. "We've decided to transfer the bulk of our assets to Victoria. She's here, she's involved, she understands the business. We think it's for the best." The words hit me like cold water. "What exactly does bulk of our assets mean, Mom?" "The vineyard, the equipment, the savings accounts. Victoria will handle everything. But don't worry, the house will still be available for family gatherings. We just need you to sign some paperwork to formalize everything." I stood up, pacing to the window. Below me, traffic moved in orderly lines, everyone knowing where they were going. I envied their certainty. Paperwork? What kind of paperwork? "Just some documents Victoria's lawyer prepared. Nothing complicated. It essentially confirms that you're, how did Victoria put it, not actively participating in family operations, and that you're comfortable with the new arrangements." My jaw tightened. "You mean you want me to sign away any claim to the inheritance?" "Cameron, please don't be dramatic. This isn't about signing anything away. This is about recognizing reality. Victoria has been here, working with us, learning the business. You've built your life in Colorado. This makes sense for everyone." I closed my eyes, feeling 15 years of distance crystallizing into something harder than grief. "When did you decide this? When did you and Dad sit down and decide that Victoria gets everything?" Another pause. "We've been discussing it for months. Victoria presented a very comprehensive plan for expanding the vineyard, modernizing operations. She's really stepped up, Cameron. She's shown initiative." Initiative. The word stung because I knew what it really meant. Victoria had shown presence. She'd shown up. And apparently, showing up was worth an entire inheritance. "I need to see these documents before I sign anything," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Of course, darling. Victoria will email them to you tonight, but please, don't overthink this. This isn't about love or fairness. This is just practical." After hanging up, I sat in my office for an hour, staring at nothing. The contract arrived at 11:47 p.m., sent from Victoria's law firm. The subject line read, "Estate planning documents, time sensitive." I downloaded the PDF with fingers that felt disconnected from my hands. Page after page of legal language that boiled down to a simple message: Victoria gets the vineyard, the equipment, the business accounts, and the investment portfolio. I get the privilege of visiting the family home for holidays, as long as I promise never to contest the arrangement. At the very end, there was a clause about the family home itself. It mentioned that ownership would need to be clarified and consolidated under the new arrangement. Something about that phrase made my stomach turn. I called in sick the next day, the first time in 2 years. Instead of going to the office, I drove to a storage unit I'd rented when I moved to Denver. Inside, buried under boxes of college textbooks and old furniture, was a fireproof document box, the one my grandmother had given me before she passed away. "Keep this safe," she'd whispered to me when I was 13, pressing the key into my palm. "There are things in here your parents might not want you to know right away, but someday, you'll need to." I'd almost forgotten about it during the chaos of building my career, starting my consulting firm, creating a life 2 states away from the family politics I'd grown tired of navigating. But now, sitting in that cold storage unit, I remembered my grandmother's intense eyes, the way she'd made me promise to keep the box safe. Inside were old family photos, my grandfather's war medals, and a manila folder labeled Property Records, Sullivan Creek Estate. My hands trembled as I opened it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The deed to our family home, dated September 15, 2008, the owners listed Thomas and Margaret Walsh, my parents, and Cameron Walsh. I blinked, read it again. There it was, in black legal text, my name, on the deed, to the house my parents had. Just told me Victoria would be inheriting along with everything else. I pulled out my phone and called the best real estate attorney in Denver. "Janet, it's Cameron Walsh. I need you to pull property records for an address in Northern California, and I need it today." 6 hours later, I was sitting in Janet's office, staring at official documents that confirmed what my grandmother's box had revealed. The deed hadn't changed since 2008. My name was on it. I owned 1/3 of the family home. "This is interesting," Janet said, adjusting her glasses. "Your parents can't transfer ownership of this property without your signature. If your name is on the deed as a co-owner, you have legal rights that can't be simply wished away. But they're acting like they own it outright. They probably forgot, or they're hoping you don't know. People forget about property additions, especially if they were added for tax reasons or estate planning 15 years ago." She leaned forward. "Cameron, what exactly are they asking you to sign?" I showed her Victoria's documents. Her expression darkened as she read. "This isn't just signing away inheritance rights. Look at Section 12. They're asking you to quit-claim any property interests. If you sign this, you'd be giving up your ownership stake in the house." The room felt like it was tilting. "They don't know I'm on the deed." "It appears not, and that puts you in a very powerful position." I drove back to my apartment in a daze. Everything I thought I knew about my family's plans suddenly seemed different. They weren't just cutting me out of the inheritance. They were trying to trick me into giving up something I already legally owned. That evening, I called Victoria directly. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Cameron, I hope you got the documents. Pretty straightforward stuff, right?" "Just formalizing what we all already know." "Victoria, I have some questions about the property section." "Oh, that? That's just housekeeping, making sure there's no confusion about the family home. Mom and Dad want everything crystal clear." "Crystal clear," I repeated. "And you helped prepare these documents?" "Well, my lawyer did most of the work. I just explained the family situation, you know? How you're doing your own thing in Colorado, how I'm here managing everything. It all makes sense, doesn't it?" I stared at the deed copy in front of me. "Victoria, Do you know who's currently on the deed to the house? A pause. Mom and Dad, obviously. Anyone else? Should there be someone else? Her voice had changed, become more careful. I'm asking if you know who else is on that deed. Cameron, what are you getting at? Why are you making this complicated? Just sign the papers and we can all move forward. I hung up. For the first time in 15 years, I felt like I had leverage in my own family. They'd built their entire plan around the assumption that I was powerless, that distance meant disconnection, that I'd simply accept whatever scraps they offered. But my grandmother had been smarter than all of us. She'd seen this coming somehow, had made sure I'd have a card to play when the family finally showed their true colors. The next morning, I booked a flight to California. It was time for a family reunion. I landed at San Francisco International on a foggy Tuesday morning, rented a car, and drove the 2 hours to Sonoma County. The familiar rolling hills looked different somehow, less welcoming, more like territory I'd have to fight for. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. Strategy, my grandmother would have called it. Never announce your moves until you're ready to. Make them count. The first stop wasn't home. Instead, I drove to the courthouse in Santa Rosa. If I was going to confront my family, I needed official documentation of what I already knew. The clerk behind the counter, a patient woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, helped me pull the complete property history for our family estate. Here's the interesting part, she said, pointing to entries on her computer screen. Your name was added in 2008, but there's been no activity since then. No refinancing, no changes, nothing. Whoever added, you knew exactly what they were doing. As I drove toward the vineyard, memories flooded back. I remembered that September in 2008 clearly now. I'd been starting my junior year at Stanford, stressed about internship applications and my economics thesis. My grandmother had insisted I come home for a weekend, said there were family matters to discuss. She'd taken me to her lawyer's office in town, a dusty place that smelled like old books and leather. Mr. Hendricks, the family attorney, had been her age, maybe older, with hands that shook slightly as he explained documents to me. Your grandmother is making sure you're protected, he'd said. Sometimes families make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. This ensures you'll always have a place in the family assets, no matter what. I'd been 20 years old, more concerned about a girl I was dating and whether I'd get into the study abroad program in Switzerland. I signed papers without paying much attention, trusting my grandmother implicitly. Now I understood. She'd seen Victoria's personality even then, had watched my parents' tendency to favor the child who demanded the most attention. My grandmother had been protecting me from a future I couldn't even imagine at 20. The vineyard looked exactly as I remembered it, except more prosperous. New equipment gleamed in the afternoon sun. A professional sign at the entrance read, Walsh Family Vineyards, Esther 1962. Victoria Walsh, Operations Manager. My name was nowhere to be seen. I parked in front of the main house, the craftsman-style home where 4 generations of Walshes had lived. Victoria's BMW sat in the driveway next to my father's old truck and my mother's sedan. A family meeting, apparently. Before going inside, I walked the property. The vineyard had expanded since my last visit. New trellises stretched across what used to be the back pasture. A tasting room had been built near the road, complete with a gift shop and parking area for tour buses. Victoria hadn't just maintained the family business, she'd transformed it. I felt a stab of something that wasn't quite jealousy, but wasn't admiration either. While I'd been building my consulting practice, Victoria had been building an empire. She'd poured herself into this place in ways I never had, never could have. But that dedication, I was beginning to realize, had come with a price, and that price was honesty. I found them in the kitchen, papers spread across the big oak table my grandfather had built by hand. Victoria looked up first, her face cycling. Through surprise, annoyance, and something like fear in rapid succession, Cameron! My mother rose quickly, smoothing her apron. What are you doing here? You didn't tell us you were coming. Surprise visit. I kissed her cheek, noting how she stiffened slightly. I thought it was time to discuss these documents in person. My father didn't get up from his chair, just nodded in my direction. Long way to come to sign some papers, son. Funny thing about these papers, I said, pulling a copy of the deed from my jacket. I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what I'd be signing. Victoria's eyes locked onto the document in my hands. For someone who supposedly didn't know about the deed issue, she looked remarkably alert. Where did you get that? She asked, her tone sharper than she probably intended. From the courthouse. Public records, Victoria. Amazing what you can find when you actually look. I set the deed on the table, right next to their stack of legal documents. Now, why don't you explain to me why you want me to sign away rights to a property I partly own? The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. My mother sank back into her chair, her face pale. My father's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. Victoria was the first to speak. You haven't been here, Cameron. You can't just show up now. And what? Claim what's legally mine? You're right. I haven't been here. I've been building a business, creating jobs, making something of myself 2 states away. But that doesn't mean I stopped being part of this family. You stopped acting like it, Victoria shot back. When's the last time you helped with harvest? When's the last time you contributed anything to this place besides criticism? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Contributing? You mean, like when I sent Dad $5,000 to repair the irrigation system 3 years ago? Or when I connected you with my client who bought 2,000 cases of your wine for their corporate events? That kind of contributing? My father spoke. Up. That's not what she means, and you know it. No, Dad, I don't know it. Explain it to me. Explain how working my ass off to build a career that could support this family in emergencies somehow disqualifies me from my inheritance. You chose your path, my mother said softly. You chose to leave. The words hung in the air like smoke. I walked to the window, looking out at the vines that had been my playground as a child. I chose to grow, Mom. I chose to see what I could become beyond these hills. That's not abandonment. That's evolution. I turned back to face them. But here's what I find fascinating. You all seem to know exactly what's in these documents Victoria prepared. Every clause, every implication. Yet none of you knew I was on the deed to this house. Victoria's face flushed. How were we supposed to know? That was 15 years ago. Grandmother told you, I said simply. She told all of us. We just didn't listen. I pulled out my phone and showed them photos I'd taken of other documents in my grandmother's box. She kept copies of everything. Every conversation with her lawyer, every decision, every reason. I read from one of her handwritten notes. Added Cameron to House Deed September 2008. Essential protection against future family conflicts. Victoria's ambition already showing concerning patterns. Thomas and Margaret, too, trusting of loudest voice. The kitchen was silent except for the tick of the old wall clock. My grandmother had seen this day coming from across the grave. She knew, I continued, that someday Victoria would try to consolidate everything under her name. She knew that being physically present would be confused with being the rightful heir. So she made sure I'd have something you couldn't just vote away or convince me to surrender. Victoria stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. You can't just waltz in here after years of absence and claim— I'm not claiming anything, Victoria. I already own it. The question is, what are we going to do about it? That evening, I checked into a small bed and breakfast in town rather than staying at the family home. I needed space to think, to plan, to process what was clearly going to become a complicated situation. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, recognized my last name. Walsh? From the vineyard? Haven't seen you in ages, dear. You're Thomas's boy who went to business school, right? As she showed me to my room, she chatted about the family, about Victoria's recent engagement to a lawyer from Napa, about the vineyard's success over the past few years. It was strange hearing about my family's life from a stranger, realizing how much I'd missed, how much I'd chosen to miss. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the empty streets of my hometown, past the high school where I'd played basketball, past the library where I'd spent countless hours studying for SATs, past the coffee shop where I'd had my first real conversation about leaving for college. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, but also more precious. I'd spent so many years focused on escaping this place that I'd forgotten why it was worth fighting for. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "We need to talk. Can you meet me at the vineyard tomorrow? Just us." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Sure, but I'm bringing my lawyer." The next morning, I called Janet in Denver. "I need you on a plane today. This is getting complicated and I need backup." "What kind of complicated?" "The kind where family members have been planning to defraud me for months, but I have enough legal leverage to blow up their entire scheme." Janet arrived that afternoon, rolling a compact suitcase and carrying a briefcase that looked like it could stop bullets. We met at a restaurant in town to strategize. "Here's the situation," she said, spreading documents across the small table. "Your name on that deed changes everything. In California, if you're a co-owner of property, any attempt to transfer or encumber it without your knowledge or consent can be challenged in court." "What about the inheritance stuff, the vineyard and the other assets?" "Those are separate issues. Your parents can give Victoria whatever they want from their personal assets. But the house is different. You own it together. They can't just will away your portion." "So, what are my options?" Janet smiled, the kind of smile that made me glad she was on my side. "You have several. You could demand they buy out your share. You could force a sale of the property. You could even move back and claim your right to live there." The idea of living at home again made me laugh. "I think I'll pass on that last option. But here's the real leverage," she continued. "Those documents they want you to sign? They're basically asking you to commit fraud. If you signed away rights you legally have, it would complicate their ability to refinance, sell, or use the property as collateral forever. Banks don't like clouded titles." That evening, Victoria and I met at the vineyard. She'd chosen the tasting room, probably thinking the public setting would keep things civil. She'd also brought her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s who looked like he billed by the heartbeat. "Cameron," Victoria began, her voice strained with false warmth, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Which misunderstanding? Is that the one where you didn't know I owned part of the family home, or the one where you've been telling everyone I abandoned the family?" Her lawyer cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on finding a solution that works for everyone." Janet opened her briefcase. "My client is open to discussions, but let's establish some facts first. Your client has been operating under the false assumption that she could unilaterally control the disposition of family assets. That assumption was incorrect. For the next hour, we went through the legal realities." Victoria's lawyer grew increasingly uncomfortable as it became clear that their entire inheritance plan had a massive hole in it. "What do you want, Cameron?" Victoria finally asked, her composure cracking slightly. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, for the first time in years. She'd grown into a formidable woman, sharp and focused and driven. But somewhere along the way, she'd also become someone who saw family as a zero-sum game. "I want honesty," I said. "I want acknowledgement that I didn't abandon this family by building a career. I want recognition that distance doesn't mean disconnection, and presence doesn't automatically equal ownership." "And legally?" her lawyer pressed. Legally, I want my fair share. Not of the vineyard. You've earned that through your work. But the house? The house is mine too. Grandmother made sure of that. Victoria's face hardened. You want to destroy everything I've built. I want to be included in something that was always partly mine. We left that meeting without resolution. But I could see something had shifted. The power dynamic, which had always favored Victoria's presence and my absence, had suddenly flipped. That night, my parents called. It was the longest conversation we'd had in years, and the most honest. We didn't know, Cameron, my mother said, her voice small over the phone. About the deed, your grandmother never explained it clearly. She explained it perfectly, I replied. You just didn't want to hear it. My father got on the line. What happens now, son? How do we fix this? For the first time since arriving back home, I felt something like hope. We start telling the truth, Dad. We stop pretending that caring about this family requires sacrificing my own life to it. And we figure out how to make this work for everyone. Including Victoria? Especially Victoria. She's put her heart into this place. I respect that. But my heart belongs somewhere else, and that doesn't make me any less part of this family. After hanging up, I stood on the balcony of my room at the B&B, looking out over the valley where I'd grown up. Tomorrow would bring more negotiations, more lawyers, more complicated conversations about money and family and what we owe each other. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Not because this was home, but because sometimes the only way to move forward is to go back and reclaim what was always yours. The next morning brought an unexpected twist. I was reviewing documents with Janet over breakfast when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Mr. Walsh? This is Patricia Hendricks. My father was your grandmother's attorney. I nearly dropped my coffee. Mr. Hendricks passed away 2 years ago. Yes, he did. I've taken over his practice and I've been going through his files. There's something about your grandmother's estate planning that I think you need to know. Can we meet today? An hour. Later, Janet and I sat in Patricia's law office, the same dusty, book-filled space where I'd signed papers 15 years ago. Patricia was about my age, with her father's careful eyes and a directness that reminded me immediately of my grandmother. Your grandmother was one of my father's favorite clients, she began, pulling out a thick file. Not because she was easy to work with, quite the opposite. She was demanding, precise, and always thinking 3 steps ahead. She opened the file, revealing documents I'd never seen before. Here's what you didn't know. Adding you to the deed was just part 1 of a larger plan. Janet leaned forward, her lawyer instincts engaged. What kind of plan? Patricia smiled. Your grandmother established a trust in 2010. She'd been watching how the family dynamics were playing out, and she created what she called an equity balance mechanism. She handed me a document with ornate legal language that took me a moment to parse. She left specific instructions that if there was ever an attempt to disproportionately distribute family assets, meaning if one heir received significantly more than another, the trust would activate. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means you have the legal right to claim compensation equal to half the value of whatever Victoria receives from the estate. Your grandmother essentially created a failsafe to prevent exactly what's happening now. The room spun slightly. My grandmother hadn't just protected my claim to the house, she'd protected my claim to equality itself. There's more, Patricia continued. She also established an educational fund specifically for family members who chose to expand their horizons, as she put it. You're the sole beneficiary. It's been accumulating interest for 15 years. Janet was already calculating. How much are we talking about? Based on current valuations, the compensation claim would be worth approximately $1,2 million. The educational fund has grown to $180,000. I sat back, stunned. All these years, I'd thought my grandmother's protection was symbolic, a guarantee I'd always have a place to come home to. I'd had no idea she'd been building a financial fortress around my future. Why didn't anyone tell me about this? Your grandmother's instructions were very specific. The trust wouldn't activate until there was an actual attempt to deny you equal inheritance. She wanted to give your family the chance to do the right thing on their own first. That afternoon, I called a family meeting. Not at the vineyard, not at the house, but at the neutral territory of Patricia's conference room. I wanted everyone to hear this information together, in an environment where no one could storm out or control the narrative. Victoria arrived, with her lawyer, looking like she was preparing for war. My parents came separately, both looking older and more fragile than I'd noticed before. The stress of the situation was taking its toll on everyone. Patricia presented the trust information, with clinical precision. She explained the terms, the triggers, the financial implications. I watched Victoria's face change as she realized that her carefully orchestrated plan hadn't just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. "This is impossible," Victoria said when Patricia finished. "There was never talk of any trust." "Your grandmother was very private about her planning," Patricia replied. "She believed that knowledge of safety nets could make people complacent. She wanted you all to make choices based on love and fairness, not legal obligations." My father spoke, up, his voice heavy. "So what happens now?" I had spent the morning thinking about exactly that question. The easy answer would be to trigger the trust, claim my $1, $2 million, and walk away rich and vindicated. But sitting in that room, looking at my family's faces, I realized that taking everything wouldn't give me what I really wanted. "I've been thinking about what grandmother would want," I said slowly. "She didn't create this trust to tear the family apart. She created it to keep us together." Victoria's lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head slightly. "Here's what I propose," I continued. "Victoria, you've put your life into the vineyard. You've grown it, modernized it, made it successful. I have no interest in taking that away from you." She looked suspicious. "Then what do you want?" "I want us to redefine fairness. I want the house to remain family property. All of our names. On the deed, with rules about how it can be used and maintained. I want the trust funds grandmother set aside to be used for their intended purpose, supporting family members who choose different paths." Janet squeezed my arm under the table. We hadn't discussed this approach. But I pressed on. "I want Victoria to buy out my theoretical claim to the vineyard at fair market value, which the trust entitles me to demand anyway. And I want our parents to acknowledge that loving this family doesn't require sacrificing my life to it." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then my mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cameron, I owe you an apology. We owe you an apology. We let ourselves believe that because Victoria was here, she cared more. But caring isn't about geography." My father cleared his throat. "What are you proposing exactly, son?" "I'm proposing we honor what grandmother really wanted, a family that supports each choice we make, even when those choices take us far from home. Victoria gets the vineyard, but pays me a fair price for my theoretical share. I keep my portion of the house, but we establish it as a family retreat for all of us. The educational trust gets used to support the next generation's dreams, whatever those dreams are." Victoria was quiet for a long time, her lawyer scribbling notes furiously. Finally, she looked up. "Why?" she asked simply. "You could take much more." "Because taking everything wouldn't make me happy, Victoria. It would just make me rich and alone. And because grandmother's real legacy isn't money, it's teaching us that we can be family even when we disagree, even when we choose different lives." Over the next 3 days, we hammered out the details. Victoria would pay me $400,000 for my theoretical vineyard interest, significantly less than the trust would have given me, but a fair reflection of the fact that I hadn't contributed to its growth. The house would remain jointly owned, with a detailed agreement about maintenance, usage, and eventual inheritance. The educational trust would be restructured to support any family member pursuing education or starting a business, with both Victoria and me as trustees. It was a hedge against future conflicts, a way to ensure that the next generation wouldn't face the same false choices we had. But the real breakthrough came during a conversation Victoria and I had alone, walking through the vineyard on my last evening in California. I was terrified, she admitted, stopping between rows of mature vines. Not of losing the vineyard exactly, but of being seen as the villain in your story. I picked a grape, tasting the sweetness that would become wine in a few months. You were never the villain, Victoria. You were just living your life the same way I was living mine. But I did try to cut you out. I did assume you didn't care. And I let you. I pulled away first, long before you pushed me out. I chose my independence over family involvement, and then got angry when that choice had consequences. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, both processing years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. The thing is, Victoria continued, I always admired what you did. Building something from scratch, taking risks, making it on your own terms. I couldn't see how to admire it and still believe what I was doing mattered. What you did here matters tremendously, I replied. You saved this place, Victoria. You turned it into something grandmother and grandfather would be proud of. I couldn't have done that. And I couldn't have done what you did. I tried, you know. After college, I applied to jobs in San Francisco, New York. But every time I thought about leaving, about really leaving, I felt like I was betraying everyone who came before us. I understood then that our conflict hadn't really been about money or inheritance. It had been about different definitions of loyalty, different ways of honoring our family's legacy. Maybe that's the real lesson, I said as we reached the edge of the property. Loyalty doesn't look the same for everyone. For you, it meant staying and nurturing what exists. For me, it meant going and creating something new. The next morning, we signed all the papers in Patricia's office. As I prepared to leave for the airport, my mother handed me a small wrapped package. This was your grandmother's, she said. She left instructions that you should have it when all this was resolved. Inside was my grandmother's old compass, the one she'd used when she and grandfather first mapped out the vineyard boundaries. There was a note in her spidery handwriting. For Cameron, may you always find your way home, even when home finds you. At the airport, Victoria surprised me by showing up to say goodbye. I have something for you too, she said, handing me a bottle of wine. This is from the 2008 vintage, the year grandmother added you to the deed. I've been saving it. The label read Walsh Family Reserve, bottled for Cameron's future. She had me make this, Victoria explained. She said someday you'd need a reminder that you were always part of the vineyard, even when you were far away. Flying back to Denver, I opened my laptop and began writing. Not a business plan or a consulting proposal, but a letter to my own future children, explaining what I'd learned about family, about belonging, about the difference between running away and growing up. I wrote about my grandmother's wisdom in preparing for conflicts she hoped would never come. I wrote about the importance of building bridges even as you pursue your own path. I wrote about Victoria's dedication and my parents' complicated love, and how sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who love us most imperfectly. But mostly, I wrote about the vineyard itself, and how some roots go so deep that distance can't kill them, only strengthen them. Back in Colorado, I made changes to my own business. I created a scholarship fund for students from rural communities who wanted to pursue business or technology careers, kids who, like me, dreamed of expanding their horizons without abandoning their heritage. I also started making regular trips back to California, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Victoria and I began collaborating on projects, combining her agricultural expertise with my business knowledge to help other family farms modernize and expand. The house became what grandmother had probably always envisioned, a gathering place where family could come together to celebrate different kinds of success. Victoria hosted harvest parties there. I brought business colleagues for wine tasting weekends. Our parents used it for their anniversary celebrations. Most importantly, I learned something my grandmother had been trying to teach me for years, that you don't have to choose between honoring your past and building your future. The strongest trees, she used to say, have both deep roots and wide branches. The trust she'd established didn't just protect my financial future. It protected the family's ability to grow, to change, to support each other's choices, even when we didn't understand them. 6 months after the settlement, I got a call from Victoria. She was pregnant, she told me, and she wanted to know if I'd be the godfather. Grandmother would have loved this, she said. A new generation that will grow up knowing they can be anything, go anywhere, and still belong here. I thought about the compass in my desk drawer, about the bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, about all the ways my grandmother had been preparing me for this moment without my knowing. I'd be honored, I told Victoria, and I promised to teach them what grandmother taught me, that the best way to honor where you come from is to have the courage to discover where you're going. That evening, I opened the 2008 vintage and toasted. The woman who'd seen the future so clearly that she'd managed to save it from the past. The wine tasted like home, like possibility, like the understanding that some gifts take 15 years to fully unwrap. 6 months later, I stood in the vineyard holding my newborn niece, Charlotte Rose Walsh, named after our grandmother. The Va'asa evening light filtered through the grape leaves, casting long shadows across the property that had once threatened to divide us, but now held us together in ways I hadn't expected. She has grandmother's eyes, Victoria said, sitting on the porch swing that had been there since before either of us was born. She has grandmother's spirit, I corrected, watching Charlotte's tiny fingers curl around mine. Independent from day one. The settlement had transformed more than just our legal relationships. It had opened conversations that had been locked away for years. Victoria's pregnancy had been complicated, requiring bed rest for the final 2 months. I'd extended my stay in California, working remotely while helping manage both the vineyard operations and her doctor appointments. During those quiet weeks, we'd talked about everything we'd avoided discussing for years, about the pressure she'd felt to be the good daughter who stayed close to home, about my guilt over pursuing dreams that took me away from family traditions, about our parents' divorce when we were teenagers and how it had shaped our different approaches to commitment and security. Most importantly, we'd talked about the future, not just for Charlotte, but for the entire family legacy. I've been thinking, Victoria said as I gently rocked my niece, about expanding beyond wine production. I looked up, intrigued. Victoria had inherited our grandmother's entrepreneurial spirit, but had always been cautious about major changes to the vineyard's operations. What kind of expansion? Educational programs, agricultural workshops for urban kids, winemaking classes, sustainable farming seminars. She paused, studying my expression. I want to create something grandmother would have loved. A place where people come to learn about the land, about tradition, about building something that lasts. The idea sparked something in me. That's brilliant. You could partner with universities, create internship programs, maybe even develop a culinary school focused on farm-to-table concepts. Exactly. And I was hoping. She hesitated, then continued with more confidence. I was hoping you might want to be involved, not as a full-time partner, but as a consultant. Help me develop the business plan, navigate the licensing requirements, create the educational frameworks. I felt that familiar tug between two worlds, the life I'd built in Colorado and the life that was calling me back to California. But this time, the tug didn't feel like a betrayal of either path. "I'd love to be involved," I said. "But I have a condition." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "We structure it so other family members who've left home can participate too. Cousin Michael in Portland with his restaurant experience, Aunt Sarah with her teaching background. Let's make it about bringing family together, not just the two of us." Victoria's face lit up. Grandmother really did know what she was doing when she set up that trust, didn't she? Over the following year, the Walsh Family Agricultural Learning Center took shape. We converted the old barn into classrooms, built demonstration gardens, and created programs that attracted everyone from elementary school students to corporate executives looking to understand sustainable business practices. The project became a model for how family businesses could evolve while honoring their roots. We were featured in agricultural journals, business magazines, and even a documentary about rural innovation. But the real success wasn't the recognition. It was watching Charlotte take her first steps between rows of vines that her great-great-grandparents had planted. One evening, as I was preparing for a return trip to Denver, I found a letter my grandmother had left with Patricia Hendricks marked, "To be opened when the family learns to work together again." The letter was vintage grandmother, direct, wise, and somehow knowing exactly what we'd need to hear years before we needed to hear it. My dear Cameron and Victoria, if you're reading this, it means you've discovered that fighting over pieces of a pie makes everyone hungry, while learning to bake together feeds everyone. I set up those legal protections not because I didn't trust you, but because I knew that fear makes people smaller than they really are. Fear of scarcity, fear of abandonment, fear of being forgotten. I wanted to remove fear from the equation, so you could choose love instead. Cameron, your gift was always seeing beyond our hills. Don't let anyone convince you that vision is betrayal. The world is bigger than this vineyard, and our family is stronger because you explored it. Victoria, your gift was always nurturing what exists into what it could become. Don't let anyone convince you that roots are limitations. Some of the strongest trees grow in the same soil for centuries, reaching higher each year. You both inherited different aspects of the same pioneer spirit that built this place. Use them together. I won't be there to see what you create, but I know it will be beautiful because it will be yours, both of yours, together. Love always, Charlotte Walsh. P.S. There's one more surprise in the trust fund. Check with Patricia about the European wine tour fund I established. It's time for this family to learn about winemaking traditions around the world. Take the trip together. 3 months later, Victoria and I were standing in a vineyard in Tuscany, tasting wines that had been made by the same family for 8 generations. Charlotte was with us, sleeping peacefully in a carrier while her mother learned about ancient fermentation techniques, and I analyzed the business models of century-old wineries. The trip wasn't just about wine education. It was about understanding how different cultures balance tradition with innovation, how families maintain unity across generations and continents, how you can honor the past while embracing change. In France, we met a family that had children working in vineyards across 3 countries, all contributing to the family business in different ways. In Spain, we learned about cooperatives where dozens of families pooled resources while maintaining individual identities. In Germany, we discovered estates that had survived wars, political upheavals, and economic crises by adapting while never abandoning their core values. Each experience reinforced something grandmother had understood long before we did. There are many ways to be loyal to your family and your heritage. Geography doesn't determine love. Distance doesn't diminish belonging. Back home, the stories from our travels became part of the Learning Center's curriculum. We created exchange programs with international agriculture students, established sister relationships with family farms around the world, and developed online courses that connected rural communities globally. The success attracted attention from other family businesses struggling with similar generational transitions. Victoria and I began consulting together, helping families navigate the complex dynamics of inheritance, legacy, and individual dreams. One case particularly stuck with me: a fishing family in Maine where the younger generation wanted to expand into ecotourism, while the older generation feared losing their traditional way of life. The parallels to our own story were obvious, but watching them find their solution reminded me how universal these challenges are. It's not about choosing between old and new, I told the family during one of our workshops. It's about finding ways for both to thrive side by side. The fishing family eventually created a business model where traditional fishing operations funded and informed their ecotourism ventures, while the tourism brought new appreciation for their traditional practices. The younger generation got their innovation, the older generation saw their traditions celebrated, and the community thrived. 5 years after the deed revelation, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I opened a West Coast office for my consulting firm, based in San Francisco but with regular operations at the vineyard. "You're coming home," my mother said when I told her, tears in her eyes. "No, Mom," I replied gently. "I'm expanding my definition of home." The arrangement allowed me to maintain my Colorado clients while developing new business on the West Coast. More importantly, it let me be present for Charlotte's childhood in ways I'd missed with my own family growing up. I watched her take swimming lessons in the creek where Victoria and I had played as children. I taught her to identify different grape varieties by their leaves. I read her bedtime stories in the same room where my grandmother had told me about. The courage it took to plant vines, not knowing if they'd survive, but believing they were worth the risk. On Charlotte's 5th birthday, we held a party that brought together family from across the country. Cousin Michael came from Portland with his wife and twins. Aunt Sarah brought her daughter's college roommates who were studying sustainable agriculture. The Learning Center's first graduates returned to share stories about their own farming ventures. As I watched 3 generations of Walshes mingling with friends, students, and colleagues, I understood something that had eluded me for years. Family isn't just about blood or geography or shared history. It's about people who choose to grow together, who support each other's dreams even when they don't fully understand them, who create spaces where everyone belongs. Victoria found me sitting alone on the porch later that evening, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling into the chair next to mine. "Just thinking about grandmother, about how she saw all of this coming, the conflict, the resolution, even Charlotte. You think she knew we'd end up here?" I smiled, remembering the compass, the trust fund, the carefully orchestrated protection that had seemed like mere sentiment until it became essential salvation. "I think she knew we had the potential to end up here. She just made sure we had the tools to find our way when we were ready to use them." Charlotte ran over, grass stains on her party dress and dirt under her fingernails from helping plant new roses in grandmother's garden. "Uncle Cameron, Mom says you have to tell me the story about great-grandmother's compass." I lifted her onto my lap, feeling the weight of tradition passing forward while knowing it would transform in her hands just as it had in mine. "Once upon a time," I began, "there was a woman who knew that the most important inheritance you can leave your family isn't money or property. It's the wisdom to navigate their own adventures while never forgetting where they came from." As Charlotte listened with wide eyes, I realized that this was grandmother's real legacy. Not the vineyard, not the house, not even the carefully structured trusts and legal protections. Her legacy was a family that had learned to honor differences, celebrate individual paths, and always make room at the table for everyone to come home. The deed that had caused so much conflict became a symbol of something larger. The understanding that ownership isn't about excluding others, but about taking responsibility for what you've been given, and ensuring it continues to grow and serve future generations. Years later, when people asked me about the inheritance battle, I would tell them it wasn't really about money at all. It was about learning to love imperfectly, forgive completely, and trust that families can survive even their deepest misunderstandings. Charlotte is now 12, already showing signs of both Victoria's nurturing nature and my wandering spirit. She talks about becoming a marine biologist, traveling to study coral reefs around the world, and will support that dream, knowing she'll always have roots at the vineyard and wings to take her anywhere. The learning center Victoria founded has expanded to include marine ecology programs. The trust fund has supported 3 more family members through graduate school and helped fund 2 cousins' startup businesses. The house has hosted weddings, reunions, and quiet getaways for family members who need a place to rest and reconnect. Most importantly, we've learned that the question was never whether to choose family or individual dreams. The question was how to create space for both to flourish together. Every Christmas, we gather in the living room where that first confrontation happened, where Victoria first showed me the documents that revealed how much they hadn't understood about what I already owned. We read grandmother's letter aloud, sharing it with Charlotte and any new partners or children who've joined the family. And every year, I understand something new in her words, some wisdom that only reveals itself when you're ready to live it. This year, Charlotte asked if she could add something to the reading. "Great-great-grandmother," she said solemnly. "Thank you for teaching us that home isn't a place. It's people who love you exactly as you are, wherever you choose to be." In that moment, I knew grandmother's real gift was complete. Not the deed, not the trust, not the legal protections, but the understanding that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies. The vineyard still bears our family name, but now it means something different than it did when I first left home. It means resilience. It means innovation rooted in tradition. It means a family that learned to grow together by first learning to grow apart. And someday, when Charlotte is old enough to make her own choices about how to honor her heritage while pursuing her dreams, she'll have everything she needs: roots deep enough to anchor her, wings strong enough to carry her anywhere, and the unshakable knowledge that she belongs wherever she chooses to plant herself. That, I realized, was grandmother's true legacy, not just preserving the past, but ensuring the future had room to flourish. 10 years after Charlotte's birth, I received a call that would test everything our family had learned about unity and forgiveness. It was Victoria, her voice tight with a strain I hadn't heard since those early days of our own conflict. "Cameron, we have a problem. A big one." I was in my San Francisco office, reviewing expansion plans for the Learning Center's new urban agriculture program. The success of our family's reconciliation had opened doors I'd never imagined. Partnerships with tech companies creating sustainable food systems, collaborations with international development organizations, speaking engagements about family, business dynamics. What kind of problem? Remember Dad's brother, Uncle Marcus? The one who moved to Australia 30 years ago? I did remember. Uncle Marcus had left after a bitter fight with our grandfather about the direction of the vineyard. He'd never reconciled with the family, never visited, barely maintained contact except for perfunctory Christmas cards. "Well, he died last month," Victoria continued. "And his son, our cousin James, just showed up at the vineyard with a lawyer and some very interesting documents." My blood chilled. What kind of documents? Apparently, when Uncle Marcus left, grandfather gave him a promissory note for his share of the family business. James claims that note was never paid, and with compound interest over 30 years. She paused. "Cameron, he's claiming he owns half the vineyard." I leaned back in my chair, watching fog roll in over the Golden Gate Bridge. Our family's hard-won peace was about to be tested by ghosts from a previous generation's conflict. How much is he claiming? $2.3 million. And if we can't pay, He wants to force a sale of the entire property. That evening, I canceled my meetings and drove to the vineyard. James Walsh, a man I'd met exactly twice as a child, sat in our family's kitchen, looking remarkably like our grandfather, but with none of the warmth I remembered. He was tall, lean, with prematurely gray hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Chen, had spread documents across the same table where we'd resolved our own conflict years earlier. "Cousin Cameron," James said, standing to shake my hand. His grip was firm, his smile cordial but cold. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I. My condolences about your father." He nodded curtly. "Dad never got over being forced out of this place. He spent his whole life building a successful wine business in Australia, but he never stopped believing this family owed him justice." Victoria gestured to the documents. "James claims grandfather gave his father a promissory note when he left. Something about buying out his share of the business." "Not claiming," James corrected. "Stating fact." He handed me a yellowed document, carefully preserved in plastic. "Signed by your grandfather, witnessed by the family lawyer. A promise to pay $75,000 for my father's share of Walsh family vineyards, with interest at 6% annually." I studied the document. The signature looked authentic and the legal language seemed genuine. But something felt off. "Why didn't your father ever collect on this?" James's jaw tightened. "Pride." Dad kept expecting the family to reach out, to acknowledge what he'd contributed. He thought someone would recognize the injustice and make it right voluntarily. And when that didn't happen, he focused on building his own legacy. But he never forgot. And he made sure I wouldn't forget either. Ms. Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Walsh, with accrued interest over 30 years, this note now represents a significant claim against the estate. We're prepared to settle for current market value of the equivalent share, approximately $3 million. Victoria's face had gone pale. Even with the vineyard's success, that kind of cash payment would require selling significant assets, possibly including portions of the land that had been in our family for generations. "And if we can't pay?" I asked. "Then we'll seek a court-ordered sale to satisfy the debt." The room fell silent, except for the tick of the old clock and the distant sound of Charlotte playing outside with her friends. I looked at this cousin I barely knew, trying to understand what drove him to threaten the very foundation of our family's rebuilt unity. "James," I said carefully, "what is it you really want here? Justice for your father? Money? Or are you trying to reclaim something you feel was taken from your family?" His composure cracked slightly. "I want recognition that my father was wronged. I want this family to acknowledge that he didn't just leave. He was pushed out by people who couldn't handle his vision for modernizing the operation." Victoria frowned. "What vision? I've heard the story, but only pieces." James pulled out another folder, this one filled with blueprints, business plans, and correspondence from the 1980s. "Your grandfather was stuck in tradition. My father wanted to expand internationally, develop premium lines, create tasting rooms, and educational programs." He paused meaningfully. "Everything you've done in the last decade, he proposed 30 years ago." I felt a chill of recognition. James was right. The plans were remarkably similar to what Victoria and I had built together. Uncle Marcus had been ahead of his time, and the family had rejected his innovations. "The difference," James continued, "is that when he proposed these changes, he was told he was betraying family tradition. When you two implemented the same ideas, you were celebrated as visionaries." Victoria and I exchanged glances. We'd always heard that Uncle Marcus left because he wanted to pursue winemaking in Australia, not because he'd been forced out for his ideas. "I'm not just here for money," James said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm here because my father died believing his own family thought he was a traitor for wanting to grow. I want that record corrected." Over the next week, I dove into family archives I'd never explored before. In boxes stored in the barn's loft, I found correspondence between Uncle Marcus and our grandfather, business proposals that were decades ahead of their time, and increasingly bitter exchanges about tradition versus innovation. One letter from Uncle Marcus to our grandmother particularly stood out. "Mother, I love this land as much as anyone, but love sometimes means pushing boundaries. The wine industry is changing. If we don't adapt, we'll lose everything Dad built. I'm not trying to destroy tradition. I'm trying to ensure it survives." Our grandfather's response was harsh. "Your ideas will ruin what took 3 generations to build. If you can't respect the way we've always done things, perhaps Australia will be better suited to your ambitions." Reading those letters, I understood. Something that reframed everything I thought I knew about our family history. Uncle Marcus hadn't been the rebel who abandoned family values. He'd been an innovator punished for seeing the future too clearly. I called James and asked to meet privately, without lawyers. We sat in the same hillside spot where I'd made the decision to fight for my own inheritance years earlier. "Your father was right," I said simply. "About the business, about the need. To modernize, about everything. He was just 30 years early." James nodded, his anger temporarily replaced by sadness. He spent his whole life proving that his ideas worked. His wineries in Australia became some of the most respected in the world, but he never got over being rejected by his own family for the same vision. What would satisfy his memory? What would make this right? James was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the valley his father had been forced to leave. "I want his name on something permanent. I want the family to acknowledge publicly that his ideas shaped what this place became. And yes, I want fair compensation for what he was owed." That evening, I presented a proposal to Victoria and our parents. Instead of viewing James's claim as a threat, we could use it as an opportunity to heal a wound that had festered for 3 decades. "What are you suggesting?" Victoria asked. "We restructure the business as a true family partnership. James gets his fair share, not 2. $3 million in cash, but equity in the operation. We rename the Learning Center the Marcus Walsh Innovation Center. We create a scholarship fund in his honor for young vintners challenging traditional methods." My father, who had been mostly quiet during the crisis, spoke up. "You want to change the business name?" "I want to expand it. Walsh Family Vineyards and Innovation Center. We acknowledge that progress and tradition can coexist, that Uncle Marcus's vision and grandfather's foundation both contributed to what we've built." The negotiations took 2 months. James proved to be as innovative as his father. He brought contacts from the Australian wine industry, expertise in international markets, and fresh perspectives on sustainable practices. But more than business benefits, his integration into the family brought something unexpected. Stories about Uncle Marcus that revealed a man far more complex than the bitter exile we'd imagined. "Dad never stopped loving this place," James told us during one of our planning meetings. He kept photos of the vineyard on his office wall until the day he died. He followed every article about the family business, every award you won. He was proud of what you achieved, even as it proved his point about needing to innovate. Victoria wiped away tears. "We wasted so much time believing he chose to leave when he was forced out for being right." The formal signing ceremony took place on a bright October day during harvest season. James brought his wife and teenage daughters from Australia, the next generation of the family we'd never known existed. As we signed the partnership documents, I thought about how the deed revelation that had nearly torn our family apart had prepared us for this moment. We'd learned to navigate complex ownership structures, to balance individual contributions with collective benefit, to see conflicts as opportunities for growth rather than reasons for division. Charlotte, now 15 and already showing interest in both marine biology and sustainable agriculture, asked to speak at the signing ceremony. Great-great-grandmother Charlotte taught us that family is stronger when everyone's gifts are recognized, she said, holding the compass that had become a family symbol. Uncle Marcus's gift was seeing the future. It just took us 30 years to catch up with his vision. James smiled, and for the first time since arriving, he looked like he truly belonged. The integration wasn't seamless. James had strong opinions shaped by 30 years in a different industry culture. His daughters, raised in Australia, found American business customs puzzling. There were disagreements about organic certification, standards, debates about expansion timelines, and cultural clashes over everything from meeting styles to holiday traditions. But we'd learned something crucial from our previous family conflicts. Tensions don't have to become fractures. Differences can become strengths if you're willing to work through them rather than around them. 6 months after James joined the partnership, we faced our first major test. A massive wildfire threatened the entire region, forcing evacuations and destroying several nearby wineries. The family had to make rapid decisions about protecting assets, supporting evacuated employees, and planning for potential total loss. James proved invaluable during the crisis. His experience with Australian bushfires helped develop evacuation protocols that saved not just property, but lives. His international contacts provided alternative markets when local distribution was disrupted by the disaster. When the fire passed, leaving our property miraculously untouched while devastation surrounded us, James stood with the rest of the family looking at the scorched landscape. Dad would have said this, he told us. Disasters reveal what really matters. And what matters isn't the vines or the buildings. It's the people who choose to rebuild together. We used the fire's aftermath as an opportunity to implement more of Uncle Marcus's forward-thinking ideas. We created a regional disaster response network for vintners, developed fire-resistant building techniques for wineries, and pioneered insurance models that protected small family farms. The Marcus Walsh Innovation Center became a research hub for climate-adaptive agriculture, attracting scientists and students from around the world. James's daughters decided to spend their gap years working at the vineyard, bringing fresh perspectives from a generation that had grown up thinking globally, while their parents focused regionally. 2 years after James's arrival, we faced another family milestone: Charlotte's graduation from high school. She'd been accepted to Stanford for marine biology, following a path that would take her even further from the vineyard than I'd ever gone. But unlike previous generations, there was no conflict about her choice. We'd learned that supporting family members' dreams strengthened rather than weakened family bonds. At her graduation party, held in the vineyard, Charlotte gave a speech that brought tears to many eyes. My family taught me that tradition isn't about doing things the same way forever. It's about carrying forward the values that matter, while adapting everything else to meet new challenges. Uncle Cameron showed me that you can love your family from across the country. Aunt Victoria proved that staying home doesn't mean staying stuck. And Cousin James reminded us that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones willing to challenge us. She paused, looking around at 4 generations of family members who had learned to honor both roots and wings. I'm going to study coral reefs and ocean conservation, following my passion just like everyone in my family has followed theirs, but I'll always remember that my strength comes from this soil, these vines, and these people who taught me that. Growth and tradition aren't opposites, they're partners. As fireworks lit up the sky that night, I sat with James on the porch, sharing the 2008 vintage that Victoria had bottled for my homecoming years ago. Your father would be proud, I told him. Not just of the business success, but of what we've all learned about family. James nodded, then smiled. He left me a letter to open if I ever reconciled with this branch of the family. Want to hear what it said? I nodded, curious about Uncle Marcus's final words. James pulled out a worn envelope and read, "Son, if you're reading this, it means the Walshes finally remembered that families grow strongest when they're planted in love, not blame. Tell them I never stopped believing in the vineyard's potential. I just wanted to see it fulfilled. And tell them that sometimes the best way to honor tradition is to challenge it." Looking around at the thriving vineyard, the Innovation Center, humming with activity, the multiple generations of family members pursuing diverse paths while remaining connected to their common roots, I realized Uncle Marcus had gotten his wish. The deed that had once threatened to divide our family had taught us about ownership, rights, and legal protections. But Uncle Marcus's story taught us something deeper. That true family legacy isn't about preserving the past unchanged. It's about creating space for each generation to build on what came before while addressing the challenges of their own time. Charlotte left for Stanford that fall, but she returned for holidays with stories of breakthrough research, international collaborations, and dreams of protecting marine ecosystems for future generations. Her path was taking her to oceans far from our valley, but she carried our values with her like seeds that would grow in new soil. James's eldest daughter decided to pursue viticulture, integrating traditional winemaking with cutting-edge technology. His youngest became fascinated with the business side of sustainable agriculture. The family tree continued to branch in new directions while drawing from the same deep roots. 10 years after the deed revelation, 20 years after my initial departure for college, I finally understood my grandmother's greatest gift. She hadn't just protected my legal rights or financial future. She'd protected the family's ability to evolve, to accommodate different dreams, to see conflict as a chance for growth rather than a reason for fracture. The compass she'd left me still sits on my desk, pointing not just north but toward a truth that took decades to fully comprehend. Home isn't a place you never leave or a tradition you never change. Home is people who love you enough to let you grow, challenge you to be better, and welcome you back when you're ready to contribute your growth to their foundation. Today, the Walsh Family Vineyards and Innovation Center stands as more than a successful business. It's proof that families can heal from decades-old wounds, that innovation and tradition can thrive together, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, it's the wisdom to turn conflict into connection, division into diversity, and ancient roots into new growth. The deed was just the beginning. The real legacy is what we built together afterward. A family that learned to honor where it came from while embracing where it's going. A business that respects tradition while pioneering change. And a love that grows stronger not despite our differences, but because of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.